Welcome to the Virginia Civics and Economics lecture series. At the end of each slide, there will be a 5-second delay. Use this time to complete your notes. When you are done, push play and move on to the next slide. This presentation will begin in 5 seconds. Welcome to Virginia Civics and Economics Lecture 2.2, Introducing Economics and Factors of Production. And it's time to go all the way back to that very first lecture and our slide on civics and economics. You see, we already covered all the civics stuff. You learned what civics was. You learned that civics is a discipline of social science. You learned that government exists and government does things, and you have to align why government exists to what government does. And you learned that being a good citizen is cool, and it's an important part of living in the United States to be able to align your citizenship into why government exists and what government does. We already covered all of this. Well, now it's time to cover the economics part. Because remember, in this country, you need to understand economics to be a good citizen. So let's go ahead and start learning about economic systems. Go to the next slide. Studying economics is very much like traveling the world. It's not that hard, but you better know what you're talking about. For example, if you're going to go visit New Zealand, you better learn some New Zealand slang. And the same holds true for economics. It's all about the lingo. So let's learn the terms that we need to use in order to understand economics. Our first term is scarcity. That's the inability to satisfy all wants at the same time. Or as the Rolling Stones once told us, you can't always get what you want, but if you try sometimes, you'll get what you need. All resources and goods are limited, and this requires that choices be made. Then we have resources. Those are factors of production that are used in the production of goods and services. We're going to break that definition down into the 4 types of resources we study. They are natural, human, capital, and entrepreneurship. Let's start with natural resources. Those are finite resources we find in the natural world. Things like trees, water, oil, fish, all the stuff that we take from the natural world and use to our advantage. We then have human resources. Those are the individuals who make up the workforce. I am an educator. I'm part of the workforce, so I am a human resource. Capital resources are goods that are produced and used to make other goods and services. Things like tractors, factories, and ovens. For example, these beautiful dump trucks. They are capital resources and they are used to move coal out of an open pit mine. Finally, we have entrepreneurship. That is the propensity of an individual to behave creatively, act with foresight, use intuition, and be alert to new opportunities. What does that look like? It looks like this guy. That's Mark Cuban, and he's used the opportunities that were presented to him to create businesses. Go to the next slide. As you've already seen, economic terms can get complex, but if you break them down into their parts, they become straightforward. So let's do that as we look at our next 2 terms, and we start with choice. That is a selection of an item or action from a set of possible alternatives. Individuals must choose or make decisions about desired goods and services because these goods and services are limited. What does that mean? There's a lot we can choose from out there, and we're going to take the things that we want and need that will help us the most. But remember, there's scarcity. There's not enough for everyone. So we have to be careful about what we choose so that that stuff is best for us in the long run. And we take all this stuff and we break it down into 2 groups. Our first group is about goods. Those are objects people want that they can touch and hold. For example, a car, a hot dog, a book. Those are all goods. Then we have services. Those are actions that people do for somebody else. A dentist, a mechanic, maybe a teacher. We all provide services that other people use. Then there's opportunity cost. This is what is given up when a choice is made. The highest valued alternative is foregone. Individuals must consider the value of what is given up when making a choice. What does all of that mean? For example, is it worth the money to buy a hybrid car versus a regular car? Or is it worthwhile to move farther away from your job to buy a bigger but cheaper house? In other words, are you giving up something in exchange for the best result? Go to the next slide. As you've seen, some economic terms are complex and they need to be broken down into their parts. Others just sound complex, but they're pretty straightforward. One of those that just sounds complex concepts is price. That's the amount of money exchanged for a good or service, and it determines who acquires that good or service. In other words, how much does something cost and who can afford it? Another one of these concepts is incentives. These are things that incite or motivate and are used to change economic behavior. For example, in the 1980s, I lived in New York, and this guy named Eddie Antar, Crazy Eddie, sold electronics. He'd come on the television and tell us, our prices are insane. So things like sales, rebates, 2-for-1 deals, those are all incentives. And incentives are really cool because they can also do the following. Sometimes we give tax breaks for buying things like hybrid cars. These are good for society. Hybrid cars, they pollute less, so we have good incentives. We can also do this. Sometimes we increase taxes for buying cigarettes. Cigarettes are bad for society. We want people not to smoke them, so we give them an incentive not to buy something. Another thing you're going to learn about economics, there's a lot of charts. And the first chart you're going to look at is the interaction of supply and demand and how it determines price. Let's define these two terms first. Demand is the amount of a good or service that consumers are willing and able to buy at a certain price. So that video game costs so much, I can buy that video game because I've got the ability to do it. Supply is the amount of a good or service that producers are willing and able to sell at a certain price. The people who make the video game say, we can make 10,000 video games and sell it at this price in order for that to work for us. How does this work? Here's our first chart. You can see in the green our demand. You can see in the blue our supply. Supply goes up, demand goes down, and at that point where supply and demand meet, we call that the equilibrium point. When you reach equilibrium, that's how much something will cost. Go to the next slide. So now it's time to take all the terms we just learned and combine them to see how people live together economically. And we're going to do this by looking at a cycle called the production cycle. Production is the combining of human, natural, capital, and entrepreneurship resources to make goods or provide services. The available resources and preferences of the consumer determine what will be produced. In other words, we need to see what we can use from the world around us and also what people really need before we can decide what we're going to make. This is what a production cycle looks like, and it always starts with an entrepreneur or a business owner like this guy, Andrew Carnegie, the famous steel magnate. He used iron and coke, those are natural resources, to make metal beams. Those are goods. So far, so good. Pun intended. Well, who's going to make those metal beams? They are going to be forged by steel workers. That's human capital, and it's going to be done in a steel plant. That's capital. This is the production cycle. So what happens next? Let's see the next slide. Guys like Andrew Carnegie could make as much steel as they want, but if nobody needs it, nobody cares. So with all production, there needs to be consumption. Consumption is when we use goods and services. Consumer preferences and price determine what is purchased and consumed. This is the other end of what we just said in the last slide. The consumer is going to decide what needs to be made, and they're only going to buy it if they can afford it. This is what consumption looks like. Let's start with a builder, like this guy, Frank Lloyd Wright. He needs a certain type of metal beam of particular quality to build a building like this. That's the Hanging Falls House, probably one of the most famous architectural structures in America. So he looks and he finds a steel plant that makes that beam. But this is only going to work if everybody can figure it out. The builder will buy the beam, but only if it is at a reasonable price for the builder. Wright needs the beam and he'll buy it, but only if he can afford it. With production comes consumption, and that is the basis of economics. Thank you for watching this lecture, and I look forward to seeing you in class.